Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the quietest nights hold the loudest secrets. Tonight, we're heading deep into the Appalachian Mountains, where forgotten cemeteries hide beneath the moss and fog. These aren't just gravestones in the woods. They're stories carved into stone, whispered through the trees, and sometimes answered back. The tales you're about to hear aren't fiction. They come from first-hand accounts, local legends, and the kind of memories people try to bury but never can. If you're drawn to the strange and the chilling, make sure you subscribe and tap the bell. We don't want you wandering these hills alone. Now, take a deep breath. The lantern light is flickering, the air is colder, and the first story waits beyond the gate. Story 1. Phantom Hound of Big Ridge. I never believed in ghosts until I heard the breathing behind me on Ghost House Trail. It was 3 in the morning when I pulled into Big Ridge State Park in Tennessee, my headlights cutting through fog so thick it seemed alive. I had been driving for 18 hours straight, running from a divorce that had stripped me of everything except my pickup truck and a growing addiction to sleeping pills. The park was supposed to be closed, but the gate hung open like a broken jaw, swaying in the mountain wind. The ranger station sat dark and empty. No cars in the lot. No signs of life anywhere. Perfect. I needed isolation. Somewhere to think, maybe somewhere to end the thinking altogether. The pills in my glove compartment whispered their promises of peace. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the old cemetery I had read about online. The Ghost House Trail. Local forums claimed it was haunted by the spirit of Mary Hutchinson, a woman who died in 1934 when her house burned down with her trapped inside. But it was not Mary, this ghost, that drew me here. It was something else the posts mentioned. Something about a dog. The trail wound through ancient oaks that seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a tunnel of shadows above my head. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, each step echoing strangely in the heavy air. The fog moved around me like smoke, and I could taste the dampness on my tongue, metallic and cold. Then I heard it, panting, heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across empty trail. Nothing, just fog and darkness and the sick feeling growing in my stomach. I was alone out here, completely alone. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and I had not seen another car for hours. The panting started again, closer this time, deliberate, like something large was following me, matching my pace step for step. I quickened my walk, but the sound stayed with me, always just outside the reach of my flashlight. My hands began to shake, and not from the cold. According to the stories, Mary Hutchinson had owned a massive bloodhound named Duke. When the fire started, Duke had tried to wake her, tried to drag her from the burning house. They found both bodies together in the morning, the dog, his paws still wrapped around her nightgown. The locals buried them side by side in the old cemetery, but Duke, his spirit never rested. He still roamed the trail, they said, still trying to save people. But save them from what? I reached the cemetery gates, wrought iron twisted with age and neglect. The headstones beyond looked like broken teeth in the fog, some tilted at impossible angles, others completely fallen. I pushed through the gate, its hinges screaming in protest. The panting stopped. Silence fell like a blanket, thick and suffocating. Even the wind died. I walked among the graves, reading names and dates with my flashlight. Thompson, Bradley, Morrison, all died decades ago, most in the 1930s. Then I found it, Mary Hutchinson, 1899 to 1934. And next to her, a smaller stone. Duke, beloved companion. That was when I saw the eyes. 2 amber points of light, floating about 3 feet off the ground, watching me from between the headstones. They did not blink, did not move, just stared with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, and the eyes followed. Another step, and they came closer. The shape materialized slowly, like fog condensing into flesh. A massive dog, easily 150 pounds, with long ears and a deep chest. Its coat was the color of dried blood, and when it opened its mouth, I could see straight through to the cemetery behind it. This was not alive. This had not been alive for a very long time. The phantom hound began to circle me, its paws making no sound on the wet grass. With each orbit, it grew more solid, more real. I could smell it now, the scent of smoke and ash and something else. Something rotten. I stumbled backward, tripped over a fallen headstone, and crashed to the ground. The bottle of pills in my jacket pocket scattered across the grass like white seeds. The dog stopped circling and sat down directly in front of me, blocking my path back to the trail. Its amber eyes fixed on mine, and I understood. It knew, somehow. This dead animal knew exactly why I had come here. Knew about the pills, about the darkness eating away at my insides, about the plan I had made in the parking lot. Duke was not here to guide me to safety. Duke was here to stop me from joining him and Mary in whatever gray world existed beyond the cemetery gates. The hound opened its mouth and began to pant again, that same heavy breathing I had heard on the trail. But now I could hear something else underneath it. A whimper, a plea. This ghost dog, this loyal spirit that had refused to abandon his duty even in death, was begging me not to give up. I reached for the scattered pills, but Duke moved faster than anything dead should be able to move. He placed one massive, translucent paw over my hand, and the cold that shot through my arm was like being struck by lightning. Images flashed through my mind. Mary Hutchinson, choking on smoke, calling for help. Duke, scratching at doors, howling in desperation. The fire consuming everything. The terrible moment when Duke realized he could not save her. And then I saw myself. Saw what would happen if I swallowed those pills tonight. Saw my ex-wife finding my body weeks later. Saw my mother collapsing at my funeral. Saw the ripple effect of pain spreading outward like cracks in glass. Duke had failed to save Mary, but he would not fail again. He would not let me become another ghost wandering these hills. The phantom hound stood up and walked to the cemetery gate. He looked back once, amber eyes pleading, then melted back into the fog. I gathered the pills and put them back in the bottle, my hands steady for the first time in months. I drove home the next morning as the sun came up over the mountains. 3 days later, I checked myself into rehab. 6 months after that, I started volunteering at a suicide prevention hotline. I never went back to Big Ridge, but sometimes, on quiet nights when I am talking to someone who has given up hope, I swear I can hear panting in the background of the call. Duke is still out there, still protecting people, still refusing to let anyone else slip away into the darkness. The phantom hound of Big Ridge does not hunt the living. He saves them, one lost soul at a time. Some spirits are not trapped by death. Some spirits are freed by it, finally able to do what they could never do in life. Duke could not save Mary Hutchinson from the fire that night in 1934. But he has been making up for it ever since, one midnight encounter at a time. If you ever find yourself alone on Ghost House Trail, and you hear breathing in the darkness behind you, do not run. Stop and listen. That faithful spirit might be trying to save your life. Story 2. Body dump of South Mountain. The first body hit the bottom of the well at exactly 11:47 p.m. and I heard every bone break. I was 3 miles into the South Mountain Battlefield Trail in Maryland, following my GPS toward what the local forums called the Devil. This well, my headlamp cut a narrow beam through the October darkness, illuminating nothing but endless trees and the occasional Civil War monument. I had driven here from Baltimore after my night shift at the warehouse, chasing urban legends and trying to forget about my divorce papers sitting unsigned on my kitchen table. The sound came from nowhere, a wet, heavy thud echoing up from somewhere deep underground, followed by the unmistakable crack of ribs snapping. I froze on the trail, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The forest went completely silent, as if every living thing had suddenly stopped breathing. Then I heard the moaning, low, anguished sounds drifting up from the earth beneath my feet. Human voices, but wrong somehow, stretched and hollow, like recordings played through broken speakers. I pulled out my phone to record, but the screen flickered and died, even though the battery had been at full charge. According to the legend, 58 Confederate soldiers had surrendered after the Battle of South Mountain in 1862. Union forces marched them to an abandoned well and executed them one by one, throwing their bodies into the darkness. The well was sealed and forgotten, but hikers claimed you could still hear the soldiers falling, night after night, for over a century and a half. I had come here thinking it was just another internet ghost story. Now, standing alone in the woods with those horrible sounds rising from the ground, I wished I had stayed home. The trail curved ahead, and my headlamp beam caught something metallic glinting between the trees. A historical marker, weathered and covered in moss. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on dead leaves that sounded like breaking bones. The bronze plaque was barely readable, but I could make out the important parts. 58 casualties, mass grave, location unknown. Another thud shook the ground beneath my feet. This one was different, closer. I spun around, scanning the darkness with my light, and saw it. a depression in the earth about 20 yards off the main trail, hidden behind a cluster of oak trees. The opening was maybe 4 feet across, covered with rotting wooden planks that looked like they had been there since the Civil War. The devil? Well, I knew I should turn around and leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in my car and drive home. But something pulled me forward, a sick fascination that I could not resist. I had spent the last 6 months sleepwalking through life, numb to everything. This was the first time I had felt truly alive in ages. I pushed through the underbrush and knelt beside the well. The wooden planks were soft with rot, and gaps between them revealed nothing but black space below. The moaning sounds were louder here, rising and falling like a tide of human suffering. I pressed my ear to the wood and immediately jerked back. Whispers. Dozens of voices whispering in unison, too faint to understand but unmistakably desperate. Pleading, and underneath it all, the wet sound of something moving in the darkness far below. That was when I noticed the smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. Death hiding behind perfume. My stomach lurched, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. I grabbed one of the loose planks and pulled. The wood came away easily, revealing more of the well opening. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could almost make out words now. Help us. Remember us. Do not let them forget. My headlamp beam barely penetrated the darkness below, but I could see the well was deep. Maybe 40 or 50 feet. The stone walls were slick with moisture and something else, something that looked like old stains. At the very bottom, shadows shifted and moved in ways that shadows should not move. Another body fell. The sound exploded up from the well like a gunshot, and this time I saw the splash of impact at the bottom of my light beam. But there was no body, just the terrible sound and the spray of something dark hitting the stone walls. I was watching history repeat itself. Every night for over 160 years, those 58 soldiers fell again, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. The betrayal, the fear, the crushing impact at the bottom of the well. Over and over, with no one to witness their suffering except the occasional hiker who stumbled across their unmarked grave. The whispers suddenly stopped. The forest went dead silent. Even the wind died, leaving me alone with my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then, slowly, a new sound began. Scratching, like fingernails on stone, coming from inside the well. Something was climbing up. I scrambled backward, but my legs felt like rubber. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by wet, sliding sounds. Whatever was down there was moving fast, scraping against the stone walls as it ascended. I could hear it breathing now, ragged gasps that echoed up from the depths. My headlamp flickered and dimmed. The batteries were dying, leaving me with a weak, yellow glow that barely illuminated my own hands. In that fading light, I saw fingers appear at the edge of the well. Gray, waterlogged fingers with black nails, gripping the stone. A face followed, sunken eyes and torn flesh, a mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The thing that had once been a Confederate soldier pulled itself out of the well and stood in the moonlight, water and worse things dripping from its tattered uniform. It was not alone. More hands appeared at the well's edge. More faces, each one twisted with the agony of their deaths. They climbed out slowly, deliberately, their movements accompanied by the wet sound of decay. 58 soldiers, murdered and forgotten, finally free to walk the earth again. But they were not looking for revenge. As my headlamp died completely, plunging me into darkness, I realized the truth. They had been trying to warn me. The whispers, the pleading voices, the desperate scratching at the stone walls. They were not trapped in the well by their deaths. They were trapped by being forgotten. The soldier closest to me pointed past my shoulder, back toward the trail. In the distance, I could see lights moving through the trees. Flashlights, multiple beams sweeping back and forth, searching, and voices, living voices, getting closer. I understood then why my phone had died, why my car had started making that strange noise on the drive here, why my ex-wife had suddenly decided she wanted to reconcile, calling me repeatedly until I turned off my phone. Someone had been watching me, tracking me, leading me here. The same someone who had been making people disappear on South Mountain for decades. The same someone who needed a new well now that the old one was full. The soldiers began to fade as the living voices grew louder. Their warning delivered. They sank back into the earth, returning to their eternal vigil. But before the last one disappeared, he pressed something cold and metal into my hand. A button from his uniform, proof that this had really happened. I ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, following muscle memory back to the parking lot. My car started on the first try, and I drove home with the button clutched in my fist, its edges cutting into my palm. The next morning, I called the police and told them about voices in the woods. They found the well 3 days later, along with evidence of recent activity. Fresh rope, new tools, and bones that were far too modern to belong to Civil War soldiers. They arrested him the following week, a park maintenance worker who had been using the old legend as cover for his crimes. 58 soldiers had been murdered there in 1862, but they were not the only victims the devil, this well, had claimed. I still have that button. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I take it out and remember the faces of those forgotten soldiers. They saved my life that night, and in return, I made sure their story was finally told. The well has been properly sealed now, with a monument marking the location of their sacrifice. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, not pleading anymore, grateful, at peace. 58 Confederate soldiers who died forgotten have finally found their rest, and the real monster who used their legend as camouflage is spending the rest of his life behind bars. Some wells hold more than water, some hold memories and justice, and the restless spirits of those who refuse to let evil triumph. The body dump of South Mountain has been filled at last, not with victims, but with truth. Story 3. Hanging Tree of Mount Unger. I never believed in ghosts until I spent 3 nights camping beneath the hanging tree at Mount Unger Cemetery in Ohio. What I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about death, guilt, and the things that refuse to stay buried. My name is David Chen, and I am a paranormal investigator. Not the TV kind with fancy equipment and dramatic reveals. The kind that drives alone to forgotten places with nothing but a camera, a notebook, and more curiosity than sense. Mount Unger Cemetery had been on my list for months after receiving dozens of emails about strange sightings near an old oak tree. The locals all told the same story. In 1987, a man named William Garrett murdered his wife Sarah in their trailer home, then drove straight to Mount Unger Cemetery. He climbed the massive oak tree that stood among the oldest graves and hanged himself with a length of rope he brought from his garage. The police found both bodies within hours, but something about that tree never felt right afterward. People claimed to see a shadowy figure swinging from the oak, its branches on foggy nights. Hikers reported hearing the creak of rope and the sound of someone crying. Most disturbing were the accounts of visitors finding fresh rope burns on the tree bark, as if something was still hanging there, still struggling. I arrived at Mount Unger on a Thursday evening in late October. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the small town of Millfield, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow sound. The entrance gate was rusted open, hanging crooked on its hinges like a broken jaw. Weathered headstones dotted the hillside, many so old their inscriptions had worn smooth. The hanging tree stood in the center of the cemetery, impossible to miss. It was enormous, easily 300 years old, with thick branches that spread like arthritic fingers against the gray sky. Even in daylight, there was something wrong about it. The grass around its base grew in strange patterns, leaving bare patches that formed what looked like the outline of a human body. I set up my tent 50 feet from the tree and waited for darkness. The first night passed quietly. I heard the usual forest sounds, saw nothing unusual, and began to think the locals had been telling tall tales. But on the second night, as fog rolled up from the valley below, everything changed. The mist came thick and fast, turning the cemetery into a maze of gray shadows. I could barely see the tree, just its dark outline looming through the fog like a sleeping giant. That's when I heard it. The sound of rope creaking under weight, slow and rhythmic, like a metronome keeping time with death itself. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the tree. The beam cut through the fog in weak circles, revealing nothing but empty branches. But the creaking continued, growing louder as I approached. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Sobbing. Deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pointed my flashlight up into the branches and saw him. William Garrett hung from the oak tree exactly as he had 37 years ago. His body swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel, rope tight around his neck, feet dangling inches above my head. But this wasn't some misty apparition or trick of light. I could see every detail. His face was purple and swollen, tongue protruding, eyes bulging with the final terror of his choice. His clothes were the same he died in, a blue work shirt and jeans, now faded and torn. He was looking directly at me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over a headstone. The flashlight beam wavered, but Garrett's body remained visible, rotating slowly as if suspended by invisible hands. His mouth moved, working around the rope, trying to speak words that would never come. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, filling the air with the sound of infinite regret. Then he began to climb down. His movements were wrong, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Arms and legs bent at impossible angles as he descended branch by branch. The rope still tight around his neck, dragging behind him like a leash. His feet touched the ground with a wet thud, and he stood there swaying, head tilted at a sharp angle from the rope, his pull. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Garrett shambled toward me, leaving dark footprints in the dew-soaked grass. As he drew closer, I could smell him. Not the sweet decay of old death, but something worse. The smell of fresh violence, of blood still warm and guilt still raw. He stopped just feet away from me, close enough that I could see the rope burns around his neck, red and weeping as if they'd been made moments ago. His lips moved again, and this time I heard him whisper a single word. Sarah. That's when I understood. This wasn't just the ghost of a man who killed himself. This was something far more complex and terrible. William Garrett wasn't hunting Mount Unger Cemetery because he died there. He was trapped there, bound by the weight of what he'd done to his wife, forced to relive his final moments for eternity. But the story the locals told wasn't complete. I spent the next day in Millfield, this tiny library, digging through old newspaper archives and police reports. What I found changed everything. Sarah Garrett hadn't just been murdered by her husband. She'd been trying to leave him, had already moved her things to her sister's house across town. The night she died, she returned to their trailer one last time to get her grandmother's wedding ring from the bedroom dresser. William was waiting for her. The police report described a scene of unimaginable violence. Sarah had fought back hard. There were signs of a prolonged struggle, broken furniture, blood on every wall. But what caught my attention was a detail buried in the coroner's notes. Sarah Garrett had rope burns around her wrists and ankles. She'd been tied up before she was killed. William Garrett hadn't just murdered his wife in a moment of rage. He tortured her first. On my third night at Mount Unger Cemetery, I came prepared with more than just curiosity. I brought a length of rope, the same type William had used on both Sarah and himself. I needed to understand what was keeping him bound to this place, why his ghost was trapped in an endless cycle of self-destruction. The fog rolled in again just after midnight, and with it came the familiar sound of creaking rope. But this time, I was ready. I stood beneath a hanging tree and called out to him. William Garrett, I know what you did to Sarah. I know why you can. Leave. The creaking stopped. The cemetery fell silent except for my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the grass around my feet. Something was coming, but it wasn't William. She materialized from the fog like smoke given form. But where William's ghost was solid and detailed, Sarah Garrett appeared as little more than shadow and suggestion. I could see the outline of a woman, arms wrapped around herself as if cold, moving with the careful steps of someone who learned to fear sudden movements. The rope burns were visible on her wrists even in her ghostly form, dark lines that stood out against her translucent skin. She stopped near the base of the tree and looked up into its branches with an expression of infinite sadness. That's when I realized the truth about Mount Unger Cemetery. William Garrett wasn't the only ghost trapped here. Sarah was bound to this place too, forced to watch her murderer, this nightly reenactment of his suicide, unable to find peace because her killer had never truly paid for his crimes. His death had been quick, a few minutes of choking compared to hours of torture. In death, as in life, he'd taken the easy way out. But Sarah wouldn't let him forget. I watched as she approached the tree and began to climb, her ghostly form moving with purpose up the ancient oak. William's hanging body tried to retreat higher into the branches, but he was trapped by his own rope, bound by his own guilt. Sarah reached him and pressed her hands against his face, and for the first time since I'd been watching William Garrett, this ghost showed real fear. The temperature plummeted further. Ice began forming on the tree bark, and my flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, I heard William's voice, no longer the whisper of a man seeking forgiveness, but the scream of someone finally facing judgment. Sarah spoke then, her voice like wind through dead leaves, carrying words I hoped never to hear. Every night, William, every night until the end of time, you'll remember what you did to me. You'll feel every cut, every burn, every moment of pain you caused. Death was too good for you, but eternity isn't. The fog began to clear, and with the first hint of dawn, both figures faded back into whatever realm holds the unquiet dead. But I stayed until full sunlight, watching the tree, waiting to see if there were any signs of what I witnessed. There were. Fresh rope burns scarred the bark where William's noose had hung. But more disturbing were the other marks I found. Scratches in the trunk that looked like fingernails, spelling out a message in letters barely visible unless you knew where to look. He will never be free. I left Mount Unker Cemetery that morning with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The locals were wrong about what haunted that place. It wasn't just the ghost of a guilty man seeking absolution. It was the spirit of his victim, ensuring he never found it. Some say justice delayed is justice denied. But I learned something different at Mount Unker. Sometimes justice is patient. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes the punishment doesn't end with death. Every October, when the fog rolls thick through Ohio's hill country, I think about William and Sarah Garrett. He is still hanging from that oak tree, and she is still there watching, making sure he remembers, making sure he pays. The hanging tree of Mount Unker stands as proof that some debts can never be settled, some crimes too terrible for even death to erase. And on foggy nights, if you listen carefully to the wind through the branches, you can still hear them both. Him crying for mercy that will never come, her ensuring it never does. Story 4. Hex of Sarver Hollow. Something shook me awake at 3:33 a.m. in the Sarver Hollow shelter. And when I opened my eyes, there was nobody there. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 days, running from a job I hated and a marriage that had died 2 years before my wife finally admitted it. The shelter in Virginia was supposed to be empty this late in October, but the logbook showed someone named George had signed in the night before. No last name, no date, just George, written in shaky handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone much older than the typical thru-hiker. The shaking came again, firm hands on my shoulders, rocking me back and forth with increasing urgency. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, but the shelter was completely empty. Just me and the sound of wind through the trees outside. My headlamp beam swept across empty bunks and mouse-chewed gear left by previous hikers. That was when I noticed the smell, sweet and herbal, like someone had been burning sage mixed with something else. Something that made my skin crawl. The scent seemed to drift from the back of the shelter, where a narrow trail led deeper into the hollow. I had read about George in the trail forums, a ghostly figure who supposedly haunted this section of the AT, waking hikers in the middle of the night for reasons nobody could explain. Most people dismissed it as just another piece of trail folklore, but sitting there in the darkness with that smell filling my nostrils, I was starting to believe. The shaking had felt so real, desperate, like someone trying to warn me about something. I checked my watch again. Still 3:33 a.m. The digital display had not changed in what felt like 10 minutes. Either my watch was broken, or time itself had stopped in this godforsaken place. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped out of the shelter, following the trail that led into the hollow. The path was barely visible, overgrown with briars and fallen branches. My boots squelched in mud that smelled like rotting leaves and something much worse. The deeper I went, the stronger that herbal scent became, until it was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. After about a quarter mile, I found the cemetery. It was hidden behind a wall of rhododendron bushes, marked only by a rusted iron gate that hung open on broken hinges. The headstones inside were old, most dating back to the 1800s. Sarver. Every single grave belonged to the Sarver family. Men, women, children. An entire bloodline buried in this forgotten corner of the Virginia mountains. But it was not the graves that made my blood run cold. It was what lay scattered between them. Small bundles wrapped in newspaper, dozens of them placed carefully around the headstones like offerings. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and when I knelt beside the nearest bundle, I could make out a date. October 15, 1934. Nearly 90 years old. My hands shook as I unwrapped the package. Inside was a mixture that defied description. Animal bones, definitely. Small ones, maybe from rabbits or squirrels. Dried herbs that looked like sage and something else I did not recognize. And spices, lots of spices, creating that sickly sweet smell that had been following me through the hollow. Pow-wow magic. I had heard of it before, an old folk practice brought to America by German immigrants. Part Christian prayer, part pagan ritual, designed to heal the sick or protect the innocent. But this felt different, darker. The bones were arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, and the herbs had been burned recently. Someone was still practicing the old ways, still leaving offerings in the Sarver Cemetery. I unwrapped another bundle, same contents, but the newspaper was newer, 1956, then another, 1973, and another, 1998. Someone had been coming here for decades, maybe generations, leaving these strange packages among the graves. The most recent bundle made my stomach turn. The newspaper was from last month. Fresh bones, fresh herbs, and something new mixed in with the spices. Hair, human hair, dark and coarse, tied with a piece of red thread. I was not alone in these mountains. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, my headlamp beam catching movement between the trees. A figure stepped into the light, and for a moment I thought it was George, the legendary hiker who haunted the shelter. But this was no ghost. The man was ancient, bent with age, wearing clothes that looked like they had not been changed in decades. His eyes were milky white with cataracts, but he moved through the cemetery with the confidence of someone who knew every stone by heart. In his gnarled hands, he carried another bundle. He knelt beside a grave at the far end of the cemetery and began to unwrap his package, muttering under his breath in a language that sounded like German mixed with something much older. I tried to back away quietly, but my boot hit a loose stone, and his head snapped up. When he looked at me, I realized those milky eyes were not blind. They were focused directly on my face, and the intelligence behind them was sharp as a knife. He smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and perfect for someone his age. He spoke then, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery despite being barely above a whisper. He was not speaking to me, but to something else, something I could not see. The air grew colder, and the smell of herbs intensified until I felt like I was drowning in it. That was when I understood. The bundles were not offerings or protective charms. They were anchors, each one bound a spirit to this place, keeping them trapped in the hollow. George was not haunting the shelter by choice. He was a prisoner, forced to wake travelers and guide them here, to this cemetery where the old man waited. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, following my headlamp beam back toward the shelter. Behind me, I could hear the old man laughing, a sound like wind through dry leaves. And underneath it, other voices. Dozens of them, all speaking in that same strange language, all growing louder as I fled. I made it back to the shelter and grabbed my pack, not bothering to properly stow my gear. As I stumbled onto the main trail, heading south as fast as my legs could carry me, I heard George one last time. Not shaking me awake this time, but calling after me in a voice full of despair. He was trying to warn me, just like he warned all the others. Some of us listened and escaped, but the bundles in the cemetery kept getting fresher, and I had seen that human hair mixed in with the bones and spices. Not everyone who visited Sarver Hollow made it out. I hiked through the night and did not stop until I reached the next town. When I finally worked up the courage to research the Sarver family, I found records going back to the 1700s. German immigrants who settled in the hollow and practiced the old ways. Pow-wow doctors who could cure ailments and cast protective spells. But the record stopped in 1934, the same year as the first bundle I found. According to local newspapers, the entire Sarver family died that October in a fire that burned for 3 days. All except one, the youngest son, Wilhelm, whose body was never found. Wilhelm Sarver would be 97 years old now, old enough to have been practicing his dark arts for most of a century. Old enough to have learned how to keep the dead from finding their rest. I never finished hiking the Appalachian Trail. Every time I close my eyes, I can smell those herbs and hear that ancient voice calling out to spirits that should have been allowed to rest decades ago. George is still out there, still trapped in Sarver Hollow, still trying to warn hikers about the hex that binds them all. The old ways never truly die. They just find new practitioners, new victims, new bundles to wrap in yesterday's newspapers. And somewhere in the Virginia mountains, Wilhelm Sarver is still tending his family, his cemetery, still feeding the hungry dead with offerings of bone and blood and the souls of travelers who ignored George's desperate warnings. Some trails are meant to be walked alone. Others lead to places where you become part of something much older and darker than you ever imagined. The Hex of Sarver Hollow has been claiming victims for 90 years, and it shows no signs of stopping. If you ever find yourself hiking through Virginia and you smell sage mixed with something sweet and wrong, turn around and walk the other way. George tried to warn me, and I was lucky enough to listen. Not everyone gets that chance. Story 5. Whispers of the Unmarked Thousand. The first time I heard them speaking my name, I thought I was losing my mind. But after 3 weeks at White Oak Flat Cemetery in Tennessee, I realized something far worse was happening. The dead weren't just talking to me. They were trying to become me. I am a genealogist by trade, specializing in forgotten graves and lost family histories. My clients pay good money to find their ancestors, to put names on unmarked stones and stories to forgotten lives. White Oak Flats was supposed to be my biggest project yet. A cemetery with over 1,000 graves, most without headstones, all without records. A field of the forgotten dead. The local historical society hired me after complaints from visitors about strange sounds coming from the ground. People described hearing voices, whispers that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They wanted me to research the cemetery, its history, and hopefully put some of these restless spirits to peace by identifying them. I should have walked away the moment I saw the place. White Oak Flats stretched across 20 acres of rolling Tennessee hillside, dotted with maybe 50 actual headstones scattered among hundreds of unmarked graves. Most were just depressions in the earth, rectangular shadows where bodies had been laid to rest without ceremony or remembrance. The oldest marked grave dated to 1847, but local records suggested burials had been happening there since the 1820s. My first day on site, I set up equipment to map the unmarked graves using ground-penetrating radar. The technology can detect disturbances in the soil, showing where bodies were buried even decades later. What I found defied everything I knew about cemetery management. The graves weren't organized in any recognizable pattern. Bodies had been buried in layers, sometimes 3 deep, as if whoever was doing the burying had simply run out of space and started stacking the dead. Worse, many of the burial sites showed signs of hasty interment. These weren't careful family burials with wooden caskets and proper ceremony. These were mass graves disguised as a regular cemetery. But the real horror started when the sun went down. I was camping on site to maximize my research time, sleeping in a small tent at the edge of the cemetery property. Around midnight on my second night, I woke to the sound of voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in whispers so soft they seemed to come from inside my own head. Names, dates, fragments of lives reduced to desperate pleas for recognition. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, died March 15, 1863. Typhoid fever, age 19, remember me. James Connor, died September 4, 1871. Consumption. Left 3 children, remember me. Sarah May, no last name given, died winter of 1888. Froze to death, pregnant, remember me. The whispers continued all night, an overlapping chorus of the forgotten dead trying to speak their identities into existence. I lay in my tent with my hands pressed over my ears, but the voices seemed to bypass my hearing entirely, resonating through my bones and into my brain. When dawn came, the whispers stopped, but I knew I found something far more complex than a simple unmarked cemetery. I spent the next day in the Sevierville Public Library, digging through historical records and old newspaper archives. What I discovered turned my blood cold. White Oak Flats hadn't started as a cemetery at all. It had been a quarantine site during multiple disease outbreaks in the mid-1800s. Cholera, typhoid, influenza, and consumption had swept through the area regularly, killing hundreds. But the local authorities had a problem. They couldn't afford proper burials for all the victims, and families were often too poor or too sick themselves to pay for headstones. So they created White Oak Flats as a disposal site for the indigent dead. Bodies were brought in wagons and buried in unmarked graves, sometimes dozens in a single day. The whispers made sense now. These weren't just forgotten souls. They were people who had died without dignity, buried without ceremony, erased from history as if they never existed at all. On my 5th night at the cemetery, something changed. The whispers became more focused, more insistent. Instead of the scattered pleas for remembrance, I heard my own name being called. Michael Torres, Michael Torres, come closer, Michael Torres. I tried to ignore it, but the voices grew louder, more demanding. They knew things about me that no historical record could contain. They whispered about my childhood in Phoenix, my divorce 3 years ago, my father, his death from lung cancer. They spoke with intimate knowledge of my life, as if they'd been watching me for years. That's when I realized they weren't just trying to be remembered. They were trying to remember being alive through me. The next morning, I found something that shouldn't have existed. Fresh dirt on one of the unmarked graves, as if someone had been digging from the inside out. Scattered around the disturbed earth were objects that had no business being there. A cell phone charger, a Starbucks cup, a receipt from a gas station dated last week. My things, items from my campsite that I distinctly remembered packing away. The dead were taking pieces of my life, trying to anchor themselves to the present through my possessions. But that wasn't the worst part. When I checked my reflection in my truck, his side mirror, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. My face was changing, subtle alterations that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly. My brown eyes flickered between blue and green. My hair appeared lighter in some angles, darker in others. My features seemed to be averaging themselves out, becoming a composite of different faces, different identities. The unmarked 1,000 weren't just borrowing my possessions. They were borrowing me. I should have left Tennessee that day, driven straight back to Arizona and never looked back. Instead, I did what any genealogist would do. I kept researching, trying to understand what was happening to me and how to stop it. The truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. White Oak Flats wasn't just a cemetery for the forgotten dead. It was a feeding ground for lost souls who had become something else entirely. Decades of being unnamed, unremembered, and unacknowledged had warped them into entities that existed only through borrowed identity. They couldn't move on because they never truly lived. They died as numbers, been buried as problems to be disposed of, and now they survived as fragments desperate to experience existence through anyone willing to get close enough. But I wasn't willing. I was trapped. On my 10th night at White Oak Flats, I woke to find myself standing in the center of the cemetery, surrounded by the unmarked graves. I had no memory of leaving my tent, no recall of walking to this spot. But there I was, barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, and I wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the earth around me, not corpses or traditional ghosts, but shadowy approximations of human forms. They moved with the hesitant steps of people trying to remember how to walk, spoke with voices that seemed to borrow inflection from different speakers. The figure closest to me wore my face, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to sculpt my features from memory. It opened its mouth and spoke with my voice, but the words weren't mine. We remember now. We remember being alive. We remember being you. More figures appeared, each one wearing aspects of my identity like borrowed clothes. Some had my mannerisms but different faces. Others had my physical features but moved with unfamiliar gestures. They were becoming me piece by piece, stealing my existence to fuel their desperate hunger for life. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was losing control of my own body as these unnamed souls claimed pieces of my identity for themselves. They'd been practicing, learning how to be me, and now they were ready to complete the transaction. But I spent 2 weeks researching their history, and I learned something they didn't expect me to know. Names have power, identity has weight, and the dead can only steal what you were willing to give up. I began to speak, not my own name, but theirs. Every name I heard whispered over the past 10 nights, every identity they shared in their desperate pleas for recognition. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, James Connor, Sarah May, dozens more, hundreds more, each name spoken with the respect and acknowledgement they'd been denied in death. The effect was immediate. The shadowy figures began to solidify, taking on more distinct appearances as I gave them back their identities. They were no longer anonymous spirits trying to steal my existence. They were individual souls with their own stories, their own right to be remembered. But naming them came at a cost. Each identity I acknowledged created a permanent link between us. I would carry their memories alongside my own, their experiences layered beneath my consciousness like geological strata of borrowed lives. I left White Oak Flats Cemetery the next morning, but I didn't leave alone. The unmarked 1,000 had been given their names back, but they remained connected to me, the person who had finally acknowledged their existence. They whisper to me still, not with desperate pleas for recognition, but with gratitude and shared memory. Sometimes I catch myself remembering things that never happened to me. A childhood in the Tennessee mountains, a death from typhoid fever, a burial without ceremony or marker. These aren't in my memories, but they re-part of me now, fragments of lives that refuse to be completely forgotten. White Oak Flats Cemetery is quiet now. Visitors no longer report hearing whispers from the ground. The local historical society considers my work a complete success. They don't know that I didn't put the spirits to rest. I simply gave them a new home. Every genealogist knows that the dead don't really die as long as someone remembers their names. What I learned at White Oak Flats is that sometimes, if you're not careful, the dead will make sure you never forget them. The unmarked 1,000 live on in my memory now. Their identities preserved in the mind of someone who understands the importance of not being forgotten. It's a heavy burden, carrying so many stories that aren't to your own. But it's better than letting them disappear completely. After all, everyone deserves to be remembered, even if it means giving up part of yourself to make sure they are. Stay close, subscribe, and ring the bell. The further we go, the darker it gets. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, or which graveyard you'd never dare visit. Story 6. Compass Spiral. My compass needle started spinning the moment I crossed the cemetery gate. Round and round it went, faster than any compass should move, like a broken clock hand trying to catch up with lost time. I tapped the glass, thinking moisture had gotten inside during the 3-hour hike up the North Carolina mountainside. But the needle just spun faster, a frantic blur of red and white that made my eyes water to watch. I was a land surveyor, had been for 15 years. I trusted my instruments more than I trusted most people. But standing at the entrance to Whispering Pines Cemetery, every piece of magnetic equipment I carried had gone completely insane. The job seemed simple enough when the county hired me: survey the boundaries of an old mountain cemetery for a property dispute between two families who had been feuding since before the Civil War. The Hendersons claimed the Mallorys had been burying their dead on Henderson land for over a century. The Mallorys said their family had owned that plot since 1847. Nobody had bothered to survey it properly because nobody wanted to climb that far up the mountain for a handful of old graves. Nobody except me. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS died 2 miles down the trail. The signal just vanished, like the satellites had forgotten this part of the world existed. Then my backup GPS failed. Then my phone lost all reception, even though I was on high ground with clear sky above. By the time I reached the cemetery, I was navigating by paper map and compass, the old-fashioned way my grandfather had taught me. Except now my compass was useless, spinning like a demented carnival ride. The cemetery itself looked ordinary enough. Maybe 30 headstones scattered across a natural clearing, most of them so weathered the names had worn away. A few newer graves from the 1950s stood near the back, but most of the burials looked much older. Civil War era, judging by the style of the markers. I pulled out my backup compass, the expensive German model I saved for difficult jobs. Its needle immediately started the same frantic spinning, so fast I could hear the tiny mechanism whirring inside the case. Then I tried my phone, this compass app. The digital needles spun just like the mechanical ones, a bright red arrow chasing its own tail in endless circles. But phones did not have magnetic compasses anymore. They used gyroscopes and accelerometers, digital sensors that should not be affected by magnetic fields. Whatever was wrong with this place went deeper than simple magnetism. I set up my surveying equipment at the cemetery, this eastern edge, trying to establish a baseline from the known property markers down the mountain. The theodolite, this internal compass, spun wildly, but I could still take angular measurements using distant landmarks. That is when I noticed the graves. They were not randomly scattered like I had first thought. Looking through my surveying scope, I could see that the headstones formed a perfect spiral pattern, starting from a central point and curving outward like a nautilus shell. The spiral was so precise it had to be intentional, planned by someone who understood geometry better than most cemetery planners of the 1800s. At the center of the spiral sat the oldest grave, a massive stone monument that had somehow resisted the weathering that had claimed all the others. The name was still clearly visible: Jeremiah Mallory, 1823 to 1847. He found the true north. I walked toward the center of the spiral, my compasses spinning faster with each step. The air grew thick and heavy, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. My ears popped repeatedly, and I could taste metal on my tongue. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees between the outer graves and the center monument. When I knelt to examine Jeremiah's headstone more closely, I found something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the base of the monument was a perfect compass rose, its 8 points oriented to the cardinal and intercardinal directions. But this compass rose was wrong. North pointed toward the grave itself, not toward the magnetic pole. East and west had been reversed. South pointed uphill, toward the mountain peak. And at the center of the compass rose, where the needle would rest, someone had carved a single word, down. My surveying equipment started screaming. Every electronic device I carried began emitting high-pitched alarms simultaneously. The theodolite S-level bubble bounced like a pinball. My laser rangefinder flashed error codes I had never seen before. Even my digital camera started making sounds it was never designed to make. But the compasses spun faster, so fast now that I expected the needles to fly apart. I backed away from the central grave, but the equipment malfunctioned worse the farther I moved from the monument. At the cemetery's edge, my theodolite toppled over despite being perfectly level on solid ground. My backup compass cracked, its glass face splitting in a perfect spiral pattern that matched the arrangement of the graves. Only when I stood directly beside Jeremiah Mallory's headstone did the equipment calm down. The compasses still spun, but slower now, almost lazily. The electronic alarms faded to soft beeps. My rangefinder managed to take a measurement, calculating the distance from the grave to the cemetery's boundary fence. 247 feet, 6 inches. Exactly. I measured the distance to the next grave in the spiral pattern. 31 feet, 3 inches. Then to the next one. 19 feet, 7 inches. Each measurement formed part of a mathematical sequence that spiraled outward from Jeremiah's grave with geometric precision. Someone had planned this cemetery according to principles I did not understand. But as I worked, taking measurements that my equipment could somehow provide only when I stood near the central grave, I began to notice other things. The ground around Jeremiah's monument felt different underfoot, softer somehow, like the earth was less solid. When I pressed my surveying rod into the soil, it sank much deeper than it should have. Too deep, like there was nothing but loose dirt for 20 feet down. I pulled out my metal detector, hoping it might give me some clue about what lay beneath the surface. The device howled like a banshee the moment I turned it on, its needle slamming against the maximum reading and staying there. Whatever was buried under this cemetery was big and metallic, and it extended far beyond the boundaries of any normal grave. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows between the headstones. I needed to finish my measurements and get off the mountain before dark. Mountain weather could change fast, and I did not want to be caught in a storm with my equipment malfunctioning. But as I worked my way around the spiral of graves, taking the measurements that somehow only worked when I maintained the correct distance from the central monument, I realized I was documenting something far stranger than a simple boundary dispute. This was not a cemetery at all. It was a machine, a massive, underground device built in the shape of a spiral, with each grave marking a specific component. Jeremiah Mallory's monument sat at the center not because he was the first to be buried here, but because he was the key that made the whole system work. He found the true north, his headstone proclaimed. But what if true north was not a direction at all? What if it was a place? A specific point in space that existed not on the surface of the earth, but somewhere else entirely? My metal detector was picking up readings that suggested the underground structure extended at least 50 feet down and covered the entire cemetery grounds. The magnetic anomaly was not random. It was focused, directed, like a lens concentrating invisible forces toward a single point beneath Jeremiah's grave. The compasses were not malfunctioning. They were responding to a magnetic field so powerful it overrode the Earth's natural magnetism. But this field was not chaotic. It had a pattern, a purpose. It was pointing down. As the shadows lengthened and the mountain air grew cold, I packed up my equipment and prepared to leave. I had the measurements the county needed for their property dispute, though I doubted either family would want to claim ownership once they learned what they had been fighting over. But as I walked back toward the cemetery gate, my compass needles began to slow their frantic spinning. By the time I reached the boundary fence, they had stopped completely. All 4 of my compasses now pointed in the same direction. Not north, not toward any magnetic pole I recognized. They pointed back toward Jeremiah Mallory's grave with the steady certainty of needles drawn by the strongest magnet on earth. I left the cemetery as fast as the mountain trail would allow, but I could feel those compass needles pulling at me even from miles away. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I threw all my magnetic equipment into the back seat without looking at it. I filed my survey report the next week, marking the cemetery boundaries as accurately as I could manage. I included a note about the magnetic anomaly, recommending further geological investigation before any property development. The county thanked me and paid my fee, but they never followed up on my recommendations. 3 months later, I heard that both the Henderson and Mallory families had dropped their property dispute. Neither side wanted anything to do with that mountain cemetery anymore. The land was eventually donated to the State Forestry Service with the requirement that it remain undisturbed in perpetuity. But sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the mountains are wrapped in fog, I take out one of my old compasses and watch its needle spin. It still points back toward that grave, toward whatever lies buried beneath Jeremiah Mallory's monument, toward the machine that someone built 170 years ago for purposes I cannot even guess. The needle spins faster on some nights than others, like it is counting down to something. Like it is waiting for the right moment to stop spinning and point straight down toward whatever truth Jeremiah Mallory found in 1847. I have never gone back to that cemetery, but I think, someday, it might call me back anyway. Story 7. Eternal Patrol of Mount Hebron. The musket fire started at exactly 3:47 in the morning, and I knew my grandfather had been right all along. I am a 41-year-old security guard from Richmond, and I spent 15 years working overnight shifts at office buildings, warehouses, and shopping centers. Nothing ever prepared me for what I witnessed during my 3 nights at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Winchester, Virginia. What I am about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have the recordings to prove it. The cemetery hired me for temporary overnight security after a string of vandalism incidents. Teenagers had been sneaking in to drink and knock over headstones, typical small-town nonsense that usually amounts to nothing more than petty mischief. The pay was decent, and Winchester seemed like a quiet enough place for an easy gig. Mount Hebron sits on a hill overlooking the Shenandoah Valley, established in 1844 and expanded rapidly during the Civil War when Winchester changed hands between Union and Confederate forces over 70 times. The cemetery holds nearly 4,000 graves, many belonging to soldiers from both sides of the conflict. What most people don't know is that the official records only account for half the bodies buried there. My grandfather had fought in Korea and always claimed that some battlefields never let their dead rest easy. He used to tell me stories about hearing phantom artillery fire near old Civil War sites, seeing soldiers who shouldn't to be there marching through morning fog. I thought it was just an old veteran's way of processing trauma until I spent my first night walking the gravel paths between those weathered headstones. The cemetery is laid out in sections, with the military graves clustered in the northeastern corner where the hill slopes down toward the old battlefield. Most of the headstones there are simple white markers, government issue, with names and dates that tell the story of young men who died far from home. But scattered throughout are larger monuments, elaborate Victorian memorials for officers and prominent families. I started my patrol at midnight, walking a predetermined route that took me through each section of the cemetery twice per shift. The first 2 hours passed without incident. Winchester is quiet at night, with only the occasional truck rumbling down Route 11 to break the silence. I checked the gates, tested my flashlight, and settled into the rhythm of footsteps on gravel. At 2:30, I noticed something odd about the military section. The temperature there was noticeably colder than the rest of the cemetery, cold enough that my breath came out in visible puffs despite the mild October weather. More unsettling was the complete absence of sound. No insects, no wind through the trees, nothing but an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. That is when I first heard the drumbeat. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. A steady rhythm, like a military march cadence echoing from somewhere beyond the tree line. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the source. The drumbeat grew slightly louder, joined by what sounded like multiple sets of footsteps moving in perfect unison. I assumed it was kids playing pranks, maybe using a Bluetooth speaker to create spooky sound effects. But as I moved toward the noise, following a path that wound between the oldest military graves, the sounds became more complex. I could make out individual instruments, drums, fifes, and something that might have been a bugle playing a tune I didn't recognize. The music was getting closer, but I couldn't see anyone. The cemetery was well lit by strategically placed spotlights, and my flashlight had a powerful beam that could illuminate objects 100 yards away. Yet the source of the music remained invisible, even as the sound grew loud enough to echo off the surrounding hills. Then the musket fire started. The first shot cracked through the night air like a thunderbolt, followed immediately by a volley of perhaps 20 rifles firing in sequence. The sound was unmistakable, different from modern gunfire in a way that made my skin crawl. These were black powder weapons, muzzle loaders that produced a deeper, more resonant boom than anything manufactured in the last century. I dropped to the ground instinctively, my security training kicking in despite the impossibility of what I was hearing. More volleys followed, creating a rolling thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once. Between the gunshots, I could hear shouted commands, though I didn't make out the words. The voices had an accent I couldn't place, something between southern drawl and clipped northern pronunciation. When the firing stopped, the cemetery fell silent again. No echo, no ringing in my ears, just that same oppressive quiet that made me feel like I was wearing earplugs. I stayed low for several minutes, listening for any sign of movement, before slowly getting back to my feet. That is when I saw them. They were standing in formation about 50 yards away, near a cluster of Confederate graves marked by a tall stone angel. At first glance, they looked like Civil War reenactors, complete with authentic uniforms, muskets, and equipment. But something about their appearance was wrong in a way that made my stomach turn. Their uniforms were too clean, too new-looking despite being clearly period-appropriate. The colors were too vivid, the brass buttons too bright, as if everything had been preserved in perfect condition for over 150 years. More disturbing was their posture. They stood at attention with mechanical precision, not moving even to breathe or shift their weight. I counted 12 soldiers in gray uniforms, with a 13th figure in blue standing slightly apart from the group. They faced each other across a gap of perhaps 10 feet, arranged as if preparing for some kind of ceremony or confrontation. None of them acknowledged my presence, even when I accidentally kicked a loose stone that clattered loudly across the gravel path. I tried to call out to them, thinking they might be historical interpreters or hobbyists who had somehow gotten permission for a late-night event. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. The air itself seemed to resist my voice, creating a sensation like trying to speak underwater. The soldier in blue, who appeared to be an officer based on his insignia, raised his right hand. The Confederate soldiers immediately shouldered their muskets and took aim. I realized I was about to witness some kind of execution or firing squad, and every instinct told me to run. But my legs wouldn't obey, as if the cold air had turned my muscles to stone. The Union officer dropped his hand, and the Confederate soldiers fired as one. The muzzle flashes lit up the entire cemetery for a split second, revealing details that should have been impossible. I could see individual blades of grass, the texture of weathered headstones, and the faces of the soldiers themselves. Those faces will haunt me forever. They were young, most appearing to be in their teens or early 20s, but their eyes held a weariness that belonged to much older men. More importantly, their eyes were completely white, rolled back as if they were looking at something inside their own skulls. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that reminded me of museum mannequins, and I could see dark veins running beneath the surface like road maps of decay. The Union officer stumbled backward when the volley hit him, but he didn't fall. Instead, he straightened up, brushed off his uniform, and walked back to his original position. The Confederate soldiers reloaded their muskets with movements that were too quick and precise to be entirely human, their hands moving in perfect synchronization as they prepared for another round. This cycle repeated 12 times. Each execution was identical to the last, with the same mechanical precision and the same impossible recovery. The officer would be shot, would stagger but remain standing, and would return to his mark for the next volley. The soldiers never missed, never hesitated, never showed any emotion beyond that same eerie focus. During the final execution, something changed. As the muzzle flashes illuminated the cemetery, I saw more figures standing among the headstones. Dozens of them, scattered throughout the military section, all wearing period uniforms and all standing at perfect attention. They were watching the execution with those same white, rolled-back eyes, silent witnesses to a scene that was playing out for reasons I couldn't comprehend. When the 12th volley ended, all the figures turned to look directly at me. I found my voice then, screaming loud enough to wake the entire town of Winchester. I ran toward the cemetery gates, stumbling over headstones and memorial flowers in my panic to escape. Behind me, I could hear the sound of marching feet, dozens of boots striking gravel in perfect unison as the phantom soldiers began to move. I made it to my car and drove straight to the Winchester Police Department, where I tried to explain what I had witnessed. The desk sergeant listened patiently before suggesting I might have been experiencing altitude sickness or stress-related hallucinations. He offered to have an officer escort me back to the cemetery to finish my shift, but I refused. The next morning, I researched the history of Mount Hebron Cemetery and discovered something that made my blood run cold. On October 15, 1862, Union forces had captured a Confederate spy near Winchester and executed him by firing squad in what is now the cemetery grounds. The execution was controversial even by Civil War standards, as the spy was barely 17 years old and claimed to be carrying false information planted by his own commanders. The date was exactly 161 years before my encounter. I also found records indicating that the cemetery had been built on the site of a Civil War field hospital, where hundreds of soldiers from both armies had died from wounds and disease. Many were buried in unmarked graves, their identities lost to poor record-keeping in the chaos of war. Local historians estimated that nearly 1,000 soldiers were interred there without proper documentation. Against my better judgment, I returned to Mount Hebron the following night. I needed to know if what I had experienced was real or some kind of breakdown brought on by too many years of working alone in dark places. I brought a digital audio recorder and a camera with night vision capability, determined to gather evidence one way or the other. The second night was worse than the first. The phantom soldiers appeared earlier, assembling in formation while I was still making my initial rounds. This time, I could see them clearly even without my flashlight, as if they were generating their own pale illumination. They moved through their eternal drill with mechanical precision, marching between the headstones in patterns that seemed to follow the layout of the original battlefield. But they weren't alone. Other figures had joined them, soldiers in different uniforms representing conflicts from across American history. I saw Continental Army uniforms from the Revolutionary War, doughboys from World War I, and Marines in dress blues from more recent conflicts. They all shared the same waxy skin and rolled back eyes, all moving with that same unnatural coordination. The audio recorder captured everything: the drum beats, the musket fire, the sound of marching feet, and something else that chilled me to the bone. Between the sounds of military activity, I could hear voices calling out names. Hundreds of names, spoken in accents from different regions and time periods, as if the cemetery itself was conducting some kind of endless roll call. I recognized some of the names from headstones I had passed during my patrols. Others were completely unfamiliar, possibly belonging to the soldiers buried in unmarked graves. The voices were desperate, pleading, as if the act of speaking these names aloud was critically important but never quite sufficient. On my third and final night, I witnessed the true purpose of the eternal patrol. The phantom soldiers weren't simply replaying old battles or executing endless drills. They were searching for something, methodically combing through every section of the cemetery as if looking for specific graves or markers. When they found what they were seeking, they would stop and salute, holding the position for exactly 60 seconds before moving on to the next location. I followed them at a safe distance, documenting their route and trying to identify the graves that received their attention. What I discovered was heartbreaking in its implications. Every grave they saluted belonged to a soldier whose identity had been lost or incorrectly recorded. They were honoring their forgotten comrades, ensuring that no warrior would remain nameless and unremembered. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't malevolent spirits or harbingers of doom. They were guardians, maintaining an eternal vigil over their fallen brothers. The execution I had witnessed wasn't a punishment or torture, but a memorial service being repeated every year on its anniversary. The young spy was being honored for his sacrifice, even as his executioners paid tribute to their own complicated role in his death. But understanding their purpose didn't make them any less terrifying. As dawn approached on that third night, the phantom soldiers began to fade like morning mist. But before they disappeared completely, their leader, the same Union officer I had seen executed repeatedly, walked directly toward me. His rolled-back eyes somehow managed to focus on my face. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. He didn't use words, but I understood his message clearly. Mount Hebron Cemetery was under their protection, and my presence had been noted and approved. I was welcome to continue my work there, but I must never interfere with their activities or attempt to document them for public consumption. The phantom soldiers had secrets to keep and duties to fulfill, and living witnesses were both a blessing and a potential threat. I quit the security job the next morning, but I've never been able to shake the memory of those 3 nights. The audio recordings I made were corrupted when I tried to transfer them to my computer, producing only static and fragments of voices speaking names in languages I couldn't identify. The photographs showed nothing but empty cemetery grounds, though I could swear I saw figures moving in some of the shots when I first reviewed them. Mount Hebron Cemetery found a permanent security guard within a week of my departure, a local man whose family had lived in Winchester for generations. When I ran into him months later, he mentioned that the job was surprisingly peaceful, with no vandalism incidents or disturbances since he started working there. He also mentioned hearing military music on quiet nights, but he seemed to consider it a comforting presence rather than something to fear. I still drive through Winchester occasionally, always taking the route that passes Mount Hebron Cemetery. During the day, it looks like any other historic burial ground, peaceful and well-maintained. But I never stop there after sunset, and I always check my calendar to make sure I'm nowhere near the area on October 15th. The phantom soldiers of Mount Hebron are still marching their eternal patrol, still calling out the names of the forgotten dead, still maintaining their vigil over brothers who died far from home. They were not evil spirits or vengeful ghosts. They were something far more profound and unsettling, proof that some duties transcend death itself, and that honor can become a prison that lasts forever. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working other security jobs, I think I can hear distant drums echoing through the darkness. The sound reminds me that there are places in this country where the past refuses to stay buried, where the dead continue to serve their country in ways the living can barely comprehend. And I know that somewhere in the hills of Virginia, 12 Confederate soldiers are still taking aim at a Union officer who will never fall, honoring a cycle of duty and sacrifice that began over a century and a half ago and shows no signs of ever ending. The eternal patrol continues, marking time in a war that may never truly be over. Story 8. Lady in Red of Arlington. The red dress was the first thing I noticed, and it should have been the last thing I ever saw. I am a grounds maintenance supervisor at Arlington National Cemetery, and in my 12 years working among those pristine white headstones, I thought I'd seen every possible way grief could manifest itself. I was wrong. What I witnessed during my night shifts in Section 60 changed everything I believed about death, memory, and the price we pay for forgetting the living while we honor the dead. My name is Marcus Thompson. I am 43 years old, a veteran myself, and I take pride in maintaining the sacred grounds where our nation's heroes rest. Arlington ISN did just a job for me. It's a calling, a way to serve my brothers and sisters who didn't make it home. The cemetery operates with military precision during the day, but the night shift belongs to the dead and those of us who guard their peace. It was October 15th when I first saw her, standing motionless among the graves in Section 60, where we bury the soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. She wore a dress that seemed to glow with its own inner light, a deep crimson that stood out like fresh blood against the white marble headstones. The dress appeared to be from another era, with long sleeves, a high neckline, and fabric that moved independently of any breeze. At first, I assumed she was a mourner who had stayed past closing time. It happens more often than you think. Families sometimes lose track of time when they revisiting their fallen loved ones, and we usually approach them gently, offering to escort them to the gates. But something about this woman made me hesitate. She wasn't crying or kneeling at a specific grave. Instead, she moved between the headstones with purpose, stopping at seemingly random markers for exactly 30 seconds each. Her posture was perfectly straight, her movements fluid and precise, like she was performing some kind of ritual or ceremony I didn't understand. I watched her for nearly an hour from my position near the maintenance building, trying to decide whether to approach. The night was unusually quiet, with none of the typical sounds you'd expect in a cemetery after dark. No wind through the trees, no distant traffic from the Potomac, not even the sound of airplanes from nearby Reagan Airport. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. The woman's face remained hidden in shadow despite the bright security lighting throughout the cemetery. Every time I tried to get a better look at her features, she would turn away at precisely the right moment, as if she knew exactly where I was standing and wanted to avoid direct contact. This went on for the entire duration of her visit, creating an unsettling game of cat and mouse that made my skin crawl. When she finally left, she didn't walk toward any of the gates. Instead, she simply faded away like morning mist, becoming translucent before disappearing completely. One moment she was there, a vivid splash of red among the white stones, and the next moment the cemetery was empty except for me and the weight of 37,000 graves. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Night shift workers often experience visual distortions caused by fatigue and the play of artificial lighting on fog or low-hanging clouds. But I knew what I had witnessed was different. The woman in red had substance, presence, and purpose. She wasn't the trick of light or a stress-induced hallucination. I didn't report the incident to my supervisor, knowing it would only result in questions about my fitness for duty. Instead, I began conducting my own investigation, spending my breaks researching the history of Arlington and looking for any reference to a woman in a red dress. What I discovered made me wish I had never started looking. Arlington National Cemetery sits on land that was once the estate of Robert E. Lee, confiscated by the Union Army during the Civil War and converted into a burial ground partly as punishment for Lee's defection. But before it became Lee's property, the land had a darker history that most visitors never learn about. In the early 1800s, the area was home to several small farms and a community that was eventually absorbed into the growing capital. Among the residents was a woman named Catherine Prescott, who had lost her husband and 3 sons in various conflicts including the War of 1812 and skirmishes with Native American tribes. Local records indicated that she had a habit of visiting the graves of soldiers, regardless of which side they had fought on or which war had claimed them. Catherine was known for wearing the same red dress to every funeral and memorial service, claiming that bright colors helped her remember the vibrancy of life while she honored the dead. After losing her entire family, she continued this practice but became increasingly obsessed with ensuring that no soldier was forgotten or left without someone to mourn them. She would travel enormous distances to attend funerals of men she had never met, always wearing that distinctive red dress. When Catherine died in 1847, she was buried in a small family plot that was later incorporated into the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. Her grave marker was removed during the expansion of the cemetery, and her remains were relocated to an unmarked section to make room for more recent burials. According to the records I found, her new resting place was never properly documented. This information should have satisfied my curiosity, but it only raised more questions. If Catherine Prescott was indeed the woman I had seen, why was she appearing now, over a century and a half after her death? And why was she focusing her attention on Section 60, which didn't exist during her lifetime? I got my answers 3 weeks later, during what would become the most terrifying night of my life. I was conducting my routine patrol through Section 60 when I saw her again, this time kneeling beside a headstone that belonged to Staff Sergeant David Martinez, killed by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan in 2009. The woman in red was placing something on the grave, though I couldn't see what it was from my position. As I approached, she looked up at me for the first time. Her face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under eyes that held a sadness so profound it made my chest ache just to look at her. But her expression wasn't malevolent or threatening. If anything, she seemed relieved to finally make contact with someone who could see her. She stood slowly, smoothing down her red dress, and gestured toward the headstone where she had been kneeling. I looked down and saw a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grow naturally in the Virginia countryside. The flowers were fresh, still glistening with dew, though no flowers grew anywhere within miles of the cemetery. The woman pointed to several other graves in the immediate area, and I could see that each one bore a similar bouquet. She had been visiting multiple graves every night, leaving flowers for soldiers who rarely received visitors from the living. Many of the headstones in Section 60 belong to young men and women whose families live too far away to visit regularly, or who have no living relatives left to remember them. I tried to speak to her, to ask who she was or why she was there, but no sound came from my throat. The oppressive silence that always accompanied her appearances had returned, creating a bubble of quiet that seemed to isolate us from the rest of the world. She seemed to understand my questions anyway, responding with gestures and expressions that were hauntingly eloquent. She led me through Section 60, stopping at grave after grave to show me the flowers she had left. Each bouquet was different, arranged with specific flowers that somehow seemed appropriate for the individual soldier buried there. Roses for a young woman who had been killed in combat, oak leaves for a career soldier who had served multiple tours, Wildflowers for a teenager who had enlisted straight out of high school. The most disturbing part of this tour was the realization that she knew details about these soldiers that weren't inscribed on their headstones. She would touch a grave marker and somehow convey information about the person buried there. Their hometown, their family situation, their dreams and fears, their final moments. It was as if she had access to the complete story of every soldier in the cemetery, not just the basic facts recorded on stone and bronze. As we continued through the section, I began to notice something that chilled me to the bone. The woman in red wasn't just visiting graves randomly. She was focusing on soldiers who had died alone, far from family, or whose deaths had been particularly traumatic. Young men and women who had suffered not just physical death but spiritual abandonment, forgotten by a nation that had moved on to other concerns. She was collecting them. I realized that Catherine Prescott, or whatever she had become, wasn't just honoring the dead. She was gathering the forgotten soldiers, creating her own invisible regiment of spirits who had nowhere else to go. The flowers weren't memorials. They were markers, indicating which souls she had claimed for her eternal vigil. This understanding hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, trying to process the implications. The woman in red watched me with those impossibly sad eyes, nodding slowly as if confirming my worst fears. She wasn't malicious, but she was possessive. She had appointed herself guardian of the forgotten dead, and she would continue collecting them for as long as soldiers died in foreign wars. The most terrifying realization came when I understood why she had finally revealed herself to me. I worked night shifts, alone among the graves, with minimal contact with the living world. I was isolated, dedicated to serving the dead, and increasingly disconnected from normal human relationships. In her eyes, I was becoming just like her forgotten soldiers, alone, unremembered, and ready for collection. She reached out toward me with one pale hand, her fingers nearly translucent in the artificial lighting. I could feel cold radiating from her touch, a chill that went deeper than physical temperature. It was the cold of abandonment, of being forgotten by everyone who had once mattered to you. The cold of realizing that your service and sacrifice had been noted, filed away, and promptly forgotten by a grateful nation. I ran through section 60, past the white headstones and manicured lawns, toward the safety of the maintenance building in the world of the living. Behind me, I could hear no footsteps, but I felt her presence following me like a shadow. The oppressive silence moved with her, creating a bubble of quiet that seemed to swallow the sound of my own panicked breathing. When I reached the building, I locked the door and turned on every light I could find. Through the windows, I could see her standing about 50 yards away, that red dress vivid against the pale headstones. She wasn't approaching, but she wasn't leaving either. She was waiting, with the patience of someone who had already been waiting for over a century and a half. I called in sick for the next 3 nights, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. More importantly, I couldn't stop thinking about the soldiers she was collecting. Were they suffering in some way? Were they trapped by her attention? Or were they grateful for someone who would never forget them? I had no way of knowing, but the uncertainty was almost worse than the fear. When I finally returned to work, I found flowers on my own locker. A small bouquet of red roses, exactly like the ones she had been placing on graves throughout section 60. They were fresh, impossibly fresh, and they smelled like the Virginia countryside in springtime. There was no note, no explanation, just flowers that shouldn't to exist in a maintenance building with no outside access. I understood the message. Catherine Prescott had marked me as one of her own. Whether I wanted it or not, I had been inducted into her invisible regiment of the forgotten. The flowers were both a warning and a promise. I would never be alone, but I would never be free. That was 6 months ago, and I still work the night shift at Arlington. The woman in red appears regularly now, sometimes close enough that I could reach out and touch her dress if I dared. She no longer tries to hide from me or avoid direct contact. We developed a routine of sorts, 2 guardians watching over the dead in our own ways. They learned to recognize which graves she is planning to visit based on subtle signs, headstones that seem slightly colder than they should be, grass that grows in perfect circles around certain markers, and an almost imperceptible humming that comes from deep underground. She is still collecting forgotten soldiers, adding them to her eternal roster of the abandoned and unremembered. The terrifying part I sensed to her presence. It This is the growing certainty that she is right. I started researching the soldiers buried in Section 60, reading about their lives and deaths, memorizing details that aren't carved into stone. I tell myself it's respect for their service, but I know the truth. I am becoming more like Catherine Prescott every day, more invested in the dead than the living, more comfortable in the silence of the cemetery than in the noise of the world outside. The flowers on my locker are replaced weekly now, always fresh, always red, always carrying that impossible scent of springtime in Virginia. They stopped trying to remove them, just as they stopped trying to understand why I no longer feel afraid when I see that crimson dress moving between the headstones. Sometimes, late at night when the cemetery is at its quietest, I catch myself wondering what it would be like to join her patrol permanently. To walk among the graves in my own distinctive uniform, ensuring that no soldier is ever truly forgotten. To become part of Arlington is eternal vigil, watching over heroes who died too young and too far from home. The woman in red continues her mission, night after night, tending to graves that rarely receive visitors from the living. And I continue mine, maintaining the grounds where she conducts her endless memorial service. We partners now, bound by service to the forgotten dead and our shared understanding of what it means to be truly alone. The red dress still catches my attention every time I see it. A vibrant splash of color in a monochrome world of white stone and black night. But now it doesn't startle me. It comforts me. It reminds me that some duties transcend death, and that being forgotten by the living doesn't mean being forgotten by everyone. Catherine Prescott found her purpose over a century ago, and she just never wavered from it. Soon, I suspect I'll find mine as well. The flowers on my locker are getting fresher, more numerous, and more beautiful with each passing week. They smell like promises and taste like inevitability. Arlington National Cemetery never sleeps, and neither do its most dedicated guardians. The woman in red and I will continue our vigil, ensuring that no hero rests alone and no sacrifice goes unremembered, even if the rest of the world moves on to newer wars and younger casualties. The red dress is beautiful in the moonlight, and I'm no longer afraid of what it represents. Soon, I think, I'll be wearing colors of my own. Story 9. Villisca Axe Murder. This echo the screaming started at exactly 2:13 in the morning, and I knew immediately it was coming from children who had been dead for over a century. My name is Robert Hayes, and I am a freelance genealogy researcher from Knoxville, Tennessee. I specialize in tracking down family histories for clients who want to connect with their roots, which means I spend a lot of time in forgotten cemeteries photographing headstones and documenting burial records. What happened to me in the mountains of eastern Kentucky changed everything I thought I knew about the past, its ability to bleed into the present. I was hired by a woman named Patricia Kellum to research her family, its connection to a mining accident that supposedly occurred in Harlan County in 1909. She had inherited some old documents suggesting that several family members were buried in a remote family plot somewhere in the Daniel Boone National Forest, but the exact location had been lost when her grandfather died without passing on the information. The research took me 3 weeks of digging through county records, mining company documents, and old newspaper archives. What I found was disturbing enough that I almost called off the job entirely. The Kellum family plot wasn't associated with any mining accident. Instead, it was the site of one of Kentucky's most brutal and mysterious unsolved murders. On March 15, 1909, 6 members of the Kellum family were found dead in their isolated cabin near what is now the Daniel Boone National Forest. The parents, James and Sarah Kellum, and their 4 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, had all been killed with an axe while they slept. The murders bore striking similarities to the more famous Villisca axe murders that would occur in Iowa 2 years later, right down to the killer covering mirrors and windows before committing the crimes. Unlike Villisca, however, the Kentucky murders received almost no media attention. The family was poor, isolated, and had few connections to the outside world. Local authorities conducted a minimal investigation before declaring the case unsolvable and moving on to other matters. The bodies were buried in a small family plot on their own property, and the cabin was burned down to prevent it from becoming a morbid curiosity. I should have stopped there. I should have called Patricia Kellum and told her that her family history contained details she probably didn't want to uncover. Instead, I became obsessed with finding that burial site and documenting what remained of the Kellum family legacy. The location took another week to pin down using old survey maps and property records. The family plot was situated on a ridge about 8 miles from the nearest forest road, accessible only by hiking trail through dense mountain wilderness. I planned a 2-day camping trip to reach the site, photograph the graves, and gather whatever information I could for my client, this family tree. I started hiking before dawn on a cold October morning, carrying camping gear and professional photography equipment in a pack that felt heavier with every mile. The trail was poorly maintained and marked only by occasional blazes on trees that looked like they hadn't been refreshed in decades. By late afternoon, I was beginning to worry that I had missed a turn somewhere and was lost in thousands of acres of national forest. That's when I heard the first sound of dragging metal. It came from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, a rhythmic scraping noise like someone pulling a heavy iron object across rocks. The sound echoed through the mountains in a way that made it impossible to determine the exact distance or direction. I stopped hiking and listened carefully, trying to identify what might be causing such an unusual noise in the middle of wilderness. The dragging continued for about 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound itself, creating an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. No birds, no wind through the trees, no insects buzzing. Just absolute silence that felt wrong in a forest that should have been alive with natural sounds. I continued hiking, telling myself that the noise had probably been caused by another camper dragging equipment or perhaps a park ranger moving maintenance supplies. But as I climbed higher into the mountains, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Several times I stopped and looked back down the trail, certain that someone was following me, but I never saw any sign of another person. Just before sunset, I found the Kellum family plot. It was smaller than I had expected, containing only 6 graves marked by simple fieldstone markers. The stones were weathered and covered with over a century of moss and lichen, but I could still make out carved initials and dates on most of them. The burial site occupied a small clearing on the ridge, surrounded by old-growth trees that created a natural cathedral overhead. What immediately struck me as wrong was the condition of the graves themselves. Instead of the neat, settled mounds you'd expect from century-old burials, the earth over each grave was disturbed and uneven. Deep gouges in the dirt suggested that something had been digging or clawing at the burial sites, though I couldn't imagine what kind of animal would be interested in graves that old. I set up my tent about 50 yards from the family plot, not wanting to camp directly on or near the burial ground out of respect for the dead. As darkness fell, I prepared my camera equipment and planned to begin photographing the headstones at first light. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and I could see my breath in small puffs as I arranged my sleeping bag. That's when the screaming started. The first scream came from the direction of the graves, high-pitched and desperate, clearly the voice of a terrified child. It lasted for several seconds before cutting off abruptly, followed by another scream from a different child. Then another. The voices overlapped and echoed through the mountains, creating a chorus of terror that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of my tent, trying to locate the source of the screams. The beam of light revealed nothing but empty forest and the silent headstones of the Kellum family plot. Yet the screaming continued, now joined by adult voices calling out in panic and pain. The sounds were clearly human, clearly distressed, and clearly impossible. Between the screams, I could hear that metallic dragging sound again, much closer now and seemingly circling my campsite. The scraping noise had a deliberate quality, as if someone was dragging a heavy axe blade across rocks, taking their time, savoring the harsh sound it made. The combination of terrified screaming and methodical metal dragging created an audio nightmare that made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Sound carries strangely in mountains, and it was possible I was hearing something from miles away that seemed much closer. But the voices were too clear, too immediate, and too obviously coming from the area around the graves. Whatever was happening, it was connected to this place and to the Kellum family buried here. The screaming lasted for exactly 23 minutes, which I know because I was checking my watch obsessively, hoping for it to end. When the voices finally faded away, they didn't diminish gradually like normal sounds would. Instead, they cut off all at once, as if someone had turned off a radio or closed a door between dimensions. The metallic dragging continued for several more minutes, moving in a slow circle around the perimeter of the family plot. I could track its progress by sound, noting when it passed behind specific trees or headstones. Whatever was causing the noise seemed to be conducting some kind of patrol, methodically covering the same ground over and over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my flashlight and camera, listening to sounds that shouldn't to exist and trying to document what I was experiencing. Around 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the inside of my tent. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I could hear the fabric of my tent crackling as moisture froze. That's when I heard footsteps. Not the dragging sound I had been hearing all night, but actual footsteps. Multiple sets, walking in formation around my tent. The steps were light, like those of children, but they moved with purpose and coordination that seemed unnatural for young people. They circled my tent 3 times before stopping directly outside the entrance. I could hear breathing just beyond the thin nylon wall. Not heavy or labored, but the soft, steady breathing of several people standing very close to where I was sitting. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes, during which I remained absolutely still, afraid that any movement would trigger whatever was waiting outside my tent. When the breathing finally stopped, I waited another hour before carefully unzipping the tent entrance and looking outside. The beam of my flashlight revealed multiple sets of footprints in the frost-covered ground around my tent. Small footprints, child-sized, arranged in a perfect circle. But there were also larger prints, adult-sized, mixed in with the smaller ones. What made my blood run cold was the realization that some of the footprints were made by bare feet. In freezing weather, in the middle of a Kentucky mountain forest, someone had been walking around my tent with no shoes. The prints showed clear toe marks and were deep enough to indicate that whoever made them had substantial weight behind them. I packed up my equipment immediately, abandoning any thought of staying for a second night or completing my documentation of the graves. As I stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack, I could hear that metallic dragging sound starting up again, now coming from multiple directions at once. Whatever was making the noise had multiplied, or perhaps I was finally hearing all the sounds that had been there all along. The hike back to my car took 6 hours, though it had only taken 8 hours to reach the burial site the previous day. I kept getting turned around on trails that I was sure I had followed correctly, and my compass seemed to be giving readings that made no sense. Several times I found myself walking in circles, passing the same distinctive rock formations or fallen trees that I had noted earlier. More disturbing was the constant sense that I was being followed. Every time I looked back down the trail, I could see movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. The metallic dragging sound continued intermittently, sometimes ahead of me on the trail, sometimes behind, sometimes seeming to come from the forest on both sides. I didn't feel safe until I reached my car and drove off the mountain. Even then, I checked my rearview mirror obsessively for the first 50 miles, half expecting to see figures in old-fashioned clothing standing on the roadside, watching me leave their territory. When I got home, I developed the few photographs I had managed to take before the terrifying night began. Most of the images were unremarkable, showing weathered headstones and forest scenery that looked perfectly normal in daylight. But one photograph stopped me cold. In the background of a shot I had taken of the largest headstone, I could clearly see figures standing among the trees. 6 figures in night clothes, ranging from small children to adults, all facing toward the camera. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their postures suggested they were watching me, studying me, perhaps deciding whether I posed a threat to their eternal rest. Most unsettling was what appeared to be a 7th figure, much larger than the others, standing slightly apart from the family group. This figure was holding something long and dark that could have been an axe handle. Unlike the family members, who seemed curious about my presence, this figure radiated menace and hostility. I researched the 1909 murders obsessively after returning from the mountains, looking for any detail that might explain what I had experienced. What I found made me wish I had never taken the job. The Kellum family murders weren't an isolated incident. Between 1908 and 1912, there were at least 7 similar axe murders throughout the rural South and Midwest, all involving entire families killed in their sleep, all remaining unsolved. The pattern suggested a serial killer who traveled from place to place, selecting isolated families and murdering them with the same methodical brutality. The killer was never caught, never identified, and the murders eventually stopped as abruptly as they had begun. But according to local folklore in several states, the killer's spirit was said to haunt the burial sites of his victims, continuing his bloody work in the afterlife. The most disturbing detail I uncovered was a newspaper account from 1911, describing strange sounds heard near the Kellum family plot. Local hunters reported hearing screaming children and the sound of metal being dragged across rocks, always occurring between 2 and 3 in the morning. Several people claimed to have seen figures in nightclothes wandering the ridge where the family was buried. These sightings continued sporadically for decades, always following the same pattern. Visitors to the area would hear the sounds of the murders being replayed, complete with the victims' terrified screams and the killer's methodical preparation. Some witnesses reported seeing the entire scene play out like a ghostly reenactment, with the murderer stalking through the forest carrying his axe while the family slept peacefully in their graves. I never delivered my research to Patricia Kellum. Instead, I returned her deposit with a brief note explaining that I had been unable to locate the family burial site. I didn't want to burden her with the knowledge of what had really happened to her ancestors, or expose her to the possibility of experiencing what I had experienced on that ridge. But the sounds followed me home. 3 weeks after my trip to Kentucky, I started hearing metallic dragging in my own house. It began as a faint scraping that I attributed to pipes or settling in the walls, but it gradually became louder and more distinct. The sound always occurred between 2 and 3 in the morning, lasting exactly 23 minutes before stopping abruptly. I tried everything to make it stop. I had my house inspected by contractors, plumbers, and pest control specialists. I installed new heating and cooling systems, thinking the sounds might be related to ductwork. Nothing helped. The dragging continued, night after night, always the same duration, always the same metallic quality. Worse were the nights when the dragging was accompanied by children's screams. The voices were faint at first, barely audible through the walls of my house. But they grew stronger over time, becoming clear enough that I could distinguish individual words and phrases. They were calling for help, crying for their parents, begging someone to stop hurting them. The sounds were heartbreaking and terrifying, made worse by my knowledge of what they represented. I realized that by visiting the Kellum family burial site, I had somehow connected myself to their tragedy. The ghostly reenactment of their murders was now playing out in my own home, turning my sanctuary into an extension of that cursed ridge in Kentucky. The killer's spirit had followed me home, bringing its victims along to replay their final moments in new surroundings. The situation reached a breaking point 6 months after my mountain hiking trip. I woke up one morning to find muddy footprints throughout my house, the same mix of adult and child prints I had seen around my tent. The prints led from room to room, as if invisible visitors had been exploring my home while I slept. Some of the smaller prints showed clear signs of running, as if the children had been trying to escape something. In my living room, I found gouges in the hardwood floor that looked exactly like axe marks. Deep cuts in the wood, arranged in a pattern that suggested someone had been practicing their swing or testing the sharpness of their blade. The gouges were fresh, still showing bright wood beneath the dark stain, though I had heard nothing during the night that would account for such damage. That is when I understood that the ghostly reenactment was escalating. The murders weren't just being replayed audibly anymore. The killer's spirit was beginning to interact with the physical world, leaving evidence of its presence and perhaps preparing for more active involvement in the lives of the living. I moved out of my house the next day, staying in a series of motels while I tried to figure out how to break the connection I had inadvertently created. But the sounds followed me everywhere I went. Hotel rooms, friends, houses, even my office downtown. The metallic dragging and children's screams had become a permanent part of my life, a nightly reminder of the tragedy I had disturbed. The research I conducted into breaking supernatural connections was both extensive and depressing. Most sources agreed that visiting the site of a traumatic death could create psychic links that were difficult to sever. The only reliable solution seemed to be returning to the original location and performing some kind of ritual or ceremony to appease the spirits involved. I returned to the Kellum family burial site on the anniversary of my first visit, exactly 1 year after the night that changed my life. The hike seemed shorter this time, as if the mountain itself was drawing me back to the ridge where 6 people had been buried after suffering unimaginable terror. The graves looked exactly as I had left them, still disturbed and uneven, still surrounded by that oppressive silence that seemed to muffle natural forest sounds. But this time, I came prepared. I brought flowers for each grave, small tokens of respect and remembrance for people who had been forgotten by history and ignored by justice. As I placed flowers on each headstone, I spoke aloud to the Kellum family, acknowledging their suffering and promising to ensure their story would be remembered. I told them about their descendant who had hired me, about family members who still carried their name and wanted to honor their memory. I apologized for disturbing their rest and asked for their forgiveness. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by normal forest sounds of wind and wildlife. The temperature, which had been unnaturally cold during my previous visit, warmed to a comfortable level. Most importantly, the sense of being watched by hostile eyes disappeared, replaced by something that felt almost like gratitude. I spent the night camped near the graves, and for the first time in a year, I experienced complete silence between 2 and 3 in the morning. No dragging sounds, no screaming children, no footsteps circling my tent. The Kellum family had found the peace they had been seeking for over a century, and they had released me from the psychic connection that had bound us together. The sounds never returned to my house. The gouges in my floor remained as permanent reminders of what I had experienced, but no new damage appeared. I was able to return to my normal life and continue my work as a genealogy researcher, though I now approach forgotten burial sites with much more caution and respect. I eventually contacted Patricia Kellum and told her a modified version of what I had discovered about her family's history. I focused on the fact that her ancestors had been the victims of an unsolved crime, emphasizing their innocence and the injustice of their forgotten tragedy. I didn't mention the supernatural aspects of my research, but I did encourage her to visit the burial site and pay her respects to family members who had been denied proper mourning. The Kellum family murders remain officially unsolved, one of many similar crimes from the early 1900s that were never properly investigated. But I know the truth about what happened on that Kentucky ridge in 1909, and I know that the killer's spirit continued to torment his victims long after their deaths. Sometimes justice requires more than police work and legal proceedings. Sometimes it requires acknowledgement, remembrance, and the simple act of placing flowers on forgotten graves. The mountains of eastern Kentucky still hold secrets, and some of those secrets are better left undisturbed. But when the past reaches out to the present, when the dead refuse to rest because they have been forgotten by the living, sometimes a living person has to step forward and bear witness to their suffering. The screaming has stopped, the dragging sound has ended, and 6 innocent people can finally rest in peace. But I will never forget those children, as voices, calling out in terror from beyond death, waiting over a century for someone to hear their cries and acknowledge their pain. Story 10. Phone call from Grandma. This grave, the phone rang at exactly 11:42 p.m. And I knew before answering that my grandmother had been trying to reach me for the past 15 years. My name is David Martinez, and I am a 40-year-old electrician from Asheville, North Carolina. I work with wires and circuits every day, so I understand how phone systems operate. What I experience with my family, this landline defies every law of telecommunications I know, and it started the night my grandmother died in 2008. Grandma Elena had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of Black Mountain, where she had moved as a young bride in 1952. The house still had the original rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall, a heavy black Bakelite model that she refused to replace despite my offers to install a modern cordless system. She used to tell me stories about the old days, when making a long-distance call was a special occasion and operators connected every conversation manually. Her favorite story involved the phone booth that used to stand at the entrance to Riverside Cemetery, where her husband was buried. She claimed that people would use that booth to call relatives with updates about funeral arrangements or to check on elderly family members who couldn't attend services. The phone booth was removed in 1983 when the town upgraded to a more modern system, but Grandma always insisted she could still hear it ringing sometimes when she visited my grandfather's grave. I thought it was just her way of processing grief, a harmless quirk that helped her feel connected to memories of better times. When Grandma Elena died of a stroke at age 86, I inherited her house and everything in it, including that old rotary phone. I planned to disconnect it and rely on my cell phone, but something made me hesitate. The phone had been part of her life for over 50 years, and removing it felt like erasing another piece of her memory. I decided to keep the landline active, at least temporarily, thinking that some of her elderly friends might still call looking for her. I could let them know about her passing and help them process their own grief. It seemed like the respectful thing to do, a small way to honor her memory while I sorted through decades of accumulated possessions. The first call came exactly 1 year after her death, at 11:42 p.m. on October 15th. I was in the living room watching television when the phone its shrill ring cut through the quiet house like a knife. The sound was harsher and more urgent than I remembered, as if the old equipment was straining to complete a connection across an impossible distance. I answered on the third ring, expecting to hear a dial tone or perhaps a wrong number. Instead, I heard the mechanical voice of an operator, speaking in the clipped, professional tone that telephone companies used decades ago. The operator asked if I would accept a collect call from Elena Martinez. The voice was tinny and distant, with the hollow quality of old analog equipment. In the background, I could hear sounds that didn't belong on any phone line. Wind blowing through trees, the distant sound of traffic, and something that might have been footsteps on gravel. I should have hung up immediately. I should have recognized that accepting a collect call from a dead person was probably not a good idea. Instead, I found myself saying yes, driven by a curiosity that overrode my common sense. I needed to know who was using my grandmother's name and why they were calling at such a late hour. The line connected with a sharp click, followed by the hollow silence that indicates an open connection. I could hear breathing on the other end, slow and labored, like someone who was struggling to speak. The background sounds were clearer now. Definitely wind through trees, definitely footsteps, and something new that made my skin crawl. I could hear the faint sound of church bells ringing in the distance, playing a melody I recognized but couldn't place. The tune was sad and haunting, like a funeral hymn being played on old bronze bells that had developed cracks over the years. Between the bell tones, I could make out what sounded like pages turning, as if someone was reading from a book in an echo-filled space. Then I heard my grandmother's voice. It was definitely her, with the same slight Spanish accent she had never quite lost despite living in North Carolina for over 60 years. But something was wrong with the way she sounded. Her voice had a hollow quality, like she was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. More disturbing was the fact that she seemed to be having trouble remembering words, pausing frequently and making sounds like she was struggling to form sentences. She kept repeating my name, over and over, as if she was trying to remember who I was or why she was calling. Between repetitions of my name, she would make other sounds, humming fragments of lullabies she used to sing to me, reciting pieces of prayers in Spanish, and occasionally laughing in a way that didn't sound quite right. The conversation, if you could call it that, lasted exactly 15 minutes. I tried to respond several times, asking questions or trying to engage with whatever was speaking to me through the phone line. But she never seemed to hear me, never responded to anything I said. It was like listening to one side of a conversation with someone else, someone I couldn't hear. When the call ended, there was no goodbye, no traditional hang-up sound. The line simply went dead with a sharp click, leaving me holding the receiver and staring at the rotary phone as if it had betrayed me. I checked the caller ID, but the old phone system didn't have that feature. There was no way to trace where the call had come from. I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe someone who knew my grandmother was playing a cruel prank, using recordings of her voice to manipulate me during a vulnerable time. Maybe it was some kind of telemarketing scam that had gone wrong, with a computer system randomly dialing numbers and playing back recorded voices. There had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew what I had heard was real. I researched the phone system in Black Mountain, trying to understand how a collect call could be placed from a non-existent phone booth. What I discovered made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The old phone booth at Riverside Cemetery had been connected to a dedicated line that was never properly disconnected when the booth was removed. The line was still technically active and the phone company's system listed as serving a location that no longer existed. More disturbing was the discovery that several other families in Black Mountain had reported similar experiences over the years. Always collect calls, always from deceased relatives, always originating from that phantom line connected to the cemetery. The phone company had received dozens of complaints about mysterious calls, but they could never explain how the calls were being placed from equipment that had been physically removed decades earlier. I also learned about the cemetery's history, which was far more complex than I had realized. Riverside Cemetery was built on land that had previously been home to a Native American burial ground, which was disturbed when the town expanded in the 1920s. Local folklore suggested that the disturbance had created some kind of spiritual unrest, allowing the dead to communicate with the living through various means. The phone booth had been installed in 1954, 2 years after several families reported receiving mysterious messages from deceased relatives. The town council thought that providing a physical location for these communications might contain the phenomenon and prevent it from affecting people is private phone lines. For nearly 30 years, the strategy seemed to work. The phantom calls were limited to the booth, and people gradually accepted them as a harmless local quirk. When the booth was removed in 1983, the phantom calls didn't stop. Instead, they were redirected to the private lines of families who had relatives buried in the cemetery. The calls always came as collect calls, always on the anniversary of the person's death, and always lasted exactly 15 minutes. Some families changed their phone numbers or disconnected their landlines entirely, but the calls found ways to reach them regardless. I spent the next year dreading October 15th, knowing that my grandmother would call again and that I would have to decide whether to accept the charges. Part of me wanted to disconnect the phone entirely, to sever whatever connection existed between the cemetery and my house. But another part of me, the part that still missed her desperately, wanted to hear her voice again, even under such disturbing circumstances. The second call was worse than the first. This time, my grandmother seemed more confused, more desperate. She repeated my name with increasing urgency, as if she was running out of time to tell me something important. Between repetitions, she began reciting details from my childhood that no one else could possibly know. Conversations we had shared, places we had visited together, private jokes that existed only between us. But the details were wrong in subtle ways that made my stomach turn. She remembered events that had never happened, conversations that had never occurred, people who didn't exist. It was as if her memories were becoming corrupted, mixed with information from other sources or other people's experiences. She was losing herself piece by piece, becoming a confused amalgamation of memory fragments rather than the coherent person I had known. The background sounds were different too. Instead of wind and footsteps, I could hear what sounded like digging. Rhythmic scraping noises, like someone using a shovel to move dirt or clay. The church bells were gone, replaced by a sound that might have been crying or might have been wind through broken trees. Most unsettling was a new voice in the background, someone else speaking in Spanish, though I didn't make out the words. This time, when I tried to respond to her, she seemed to hear me. She would pause when I spoke, as if listening, then react with sounds of confusion or distress. It became clear that she didn't understand why she was calling or what she was supposed to say. She was trapped in some kind of loop, compelled to reach out to the living but unable to communicate effectively. The call ended the same way as before, with an abrupt disconnection that left me holding a dead phone. But this time, something had changed in my house. The temperature had dropped noticeably during the conversation, and I could see my breath in small puffs as I hung up the receiver. More disturbing was the smell that lingered in the kitchen. Damp earth and old flowers, like the inside of a mausoleum that hadn't been properly maintained. Over the following weeks, I began experiencing other phenomena that seemed connected to the phone calls. I would hear the rotary phone ringing at all hours, but when I answered, there would be no one there. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, as if someone was walking through rooms that I wasn't currently occupying. The smell of earth and old flowers became a permanent feature of the house, strongest near the kitchen where the phone was mounted. I started researching ways to break supernatural connections, reading everything I could find about ghost communication and spiritual attachments. Most sources agreed that spirits who tried to contact the living were usually trapped by unfinished business or unresolved emotional connections. The key to helping them was figuring out what they needed and finding a way to provide it. The third call gave me the answer I was looking for. My grandmother, whose voice was clearer this time, more focused. Instead of repeating my name endlessly, she began telling me a story about something that had happened shortly before her death. She had been trying to tell me about a box hidden in her house, something important that she needed me to find. But every time she had tried to bring up the subject, she would get distracted or forget what she was saying. Now, speaking from beyond death, she was finally able to complete the message she had been trying to deliver. The box was hidden in the basement, behind the old water heater, wrapped in a blanket that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside were documents and photographs that she wanted me to have, family history that would be lost if I didn't to preserve it. But there was something else in the box, something she was afraid to mention directly. She kept referring to it as the mistake or the thing I should have done differently. Her voice became agitated when she talked about this mystery item, and the background sounds on the phone line grew louder and more chaotic. The call lasted longer than 15 minutes this time, stretching to nearly half an hour as she struggled to explain what I needed to do. She wanted me to take the contents of the box to the cemetery, to her grave specifically, and to bury them with her. Only then would she be able to rest peacefully and stop trying to reach me through the phantom phone line. When the call ended, I went immediately to the basement and found the box exactly where she had described it. Inside were family photographs going back 4 generations, immigration documents from when her parents came to America, and legal papers related to property that had been in the family for decades. But at the bottom of the box was something that made me understand why my grandmother had been unable to rest peacefully. It was a birth certificate for a child I had never heard of, a baby born to my grandmother in 1951, a year before she married my grandfather. The child, a daughter named Maria, had died at 6 months old and was buried in an unmarked grave in Riverside Cemetery. My grandmother had kept this secret her entire life, never telling anyone about the daughter she had lost before building the family that I knew. The birth certificate was accompanied by a letter she had written but never sent, addressed to the baby, his father. The letter explained her decision to keep the child's existence secret and expressed her guilt about never properly mourning the daughter she had lost. She had buried the baby quickly and quietly, without a headstone or marker, and had spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of that hidden grief. Now I understood why she was calling from the cemetery. She wasn't trying to reach me from her own grave. She was calling from the area where her first daughter was buried, trying to make peace with a loss she had never properly processed. The phantom phone booth had originally been located directly across from the unmarked grave where baby Maria lay forgotten. I took the contents of the box to Riverside Cemetery the next day, but I didn't bury them with my grandmother. Instead, I used the information from the birth certificate to locate the unmarked grave where Maria was buried. I placed a small headstone there, engraved with her name and dates, and buried the letter and birth certificate beside it. The change was immediate and profound. The oppressive atmosphere in my grandmother's house lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. The strange smells disappeared, the unexplained sounds stopped, and the rotary phone returned to its normal, silent state. Most importantly, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced since my grandmother's death. October 15th came and went without a phone call. For the first time in 3 years, my grandmother didn't try to reach me through the phantom line connected to Riverside Cemetery. The cycle had been broken, the unfinished business resolved, and both generations of my family could finally rest in peace. But the experience changed my understanding of how the past can reach into the present. There are connections between the living and the dead that transcend our understanding of physics and technology. Sometimes those connections manifest through familiar objects like telephones, using the tools of communication to bridge the gap between worlds. I still live in my grandmother's house, and I still keep the old rotary phone connected. Not because I expect her to call again, but because I now understand that some forms of communication are too important to abandon. The phone serves as a reminder that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes the dead need the living to help them complete unfinished business. Other families in Black Mountain continue to receive their annual calls from deceased relatives. The phantom line connected to Riverside Cemetery remains active, carrying messages between generations that are separated by death but not by love. Most people hang up on these calls, afraid of what they might mean or unwilling to engage with phenomena they can't explain. But I've learned that sometimes the dead are trying to tell us things we need to know. Sometimes they're carrying burdens that only the living can help them release. And sometimes, accepting a collect call from beyond the grave is an act of love that can bring peace to both the caller and the person who answers. The rotary phone in my kitchen hasn't rung since that final conversation with my grandmother. But every October 15th, I make sure to be home at 11:42 p.m., just in case. Not because I expect her to call, but because I want her to know that if she ever needs to reach me again, I'll be there to accept the charges. Some connections are too important to disconnect, even when they originate from places that no longer exist and reach across distances that can be measured in miles. The phantom phone booth at Riverside Cemetery may be long gone, but the love it helped facilitate continues to echo through the decades, one collect call at a time. Another night, another Appalachian cemetery, and yet it still feels like someone's walking right behind us. Subscribe and turn on notifications to keep your lantern lit. Share your location or a creepy experience you've had in the comments. Out here, the stories don't stop when the video ends. They're waiting for you to come back.